Hello, hello, hello. Karen Frankel here with you to get you all drawing once again on a Friday afternoon. The subject of today's tutorial is getting your proportions right. I'm sure you've all personally got gorgeous proportions, but when it comes to drawing, you know what I'm talking about. They need to be looked at very carefully, observed very carefully, so that you can translate the proportions that you see accurately onto your page. But lots of people get confused by proportions, sometimes not quite sure what the proportions are. I know when I teach the subject, I have to explain more often than not how to transfer measured proportions, the proportions that we see. How do you put that into your drawings, and why is it so important to get that as accurate as we possibly can? A definition of proportion. Another way of saying proportion, I guess, could be ratio. Means the same thing as far as I understand. But whenever we are talking about proportion, we are talking about one size compared to another size. So proportion is related to ratio. It means how tall is that, for example, relative to its width. And it is never talking about size. So we never say how big is something in centimeters or millimeters when we are drawing. But when it comes to measuring proportion, just remember that proportion is always one size related to another, one measurement compared with another. And I'm just going to use my pencil. Now, I know you've got a top-down camera, but the way I teach, if you've got my book or if you've seen other videos from me, can you imagine that this pencil that you can see, in fact, it's when I put it down on the page, it's right on top of the page like that. I've actually put it down. But when you measure proportions, remember I've taught you to have your pencil vertically against something that's between you and the camera, but just pretend that these pairs are in front of me and I'm measuring them with my pencil like that. I'll turn it over because I prefer using the top of the pencil, and I'm moving my thumb. I'm looking at the camera now, you can see. I'm not actually measuring it on the paper. So the height of the pair in this instance is that, and I'll compare it to the width. It's quite difficult to do with a raised pencil. And basically I've seen that that size, that height, is the same as the width. If I actually put my pencil on the paper, obviously you can't do that with life, which is why we put those pencils up vertically. But if I take advantage of the fact that it's flat and I measure the height with my pencil like that, and I compare it to the width. Let me get my fingers out the way. So that's the width, yep, and that's the height. So this particular pair is pretty much as wide as it's tall. So that's what proportion is. How big is one measurement against the other? And you can see that I didn't say how many centimeters is that. I didn't take a ruler. Please don't take a ruler. It's really not very useful because then you get caught up in these 3.5 centimeters and all that sort of thing. What you can see on your pencil when you're viewing it like usual when we measure is good enough. You don't have to have within a millimeter of accuracy. Okay, sometimes when I am measuring on a photograph, when we've got the advantage of a photograph, I might use just a random piece of paper, put the piece of paper at the top of what I'm measuring, make a mark at the bottom, so that represents the height of this pair, and then I can compare the pair. I can compare the width to the height at its maximum, and I can see that it's the same. So no matter what you do it with, it is about comparison. One of the other things we can do in this instance with this pair is find out what the proportion of the stalk is to the whole pair. And as drawers, each of us will find what we like to measure. There isn't a rule about what to measure, as long as you're comparing one measurement to another, always. So I know on my piece of paper that that's both the width and the height. So I can now go, well, how big is the stalk? So I'm measuring on the piece of paper the stalk. I've just written stalk there, or I can take my pencil. If I were viewing it in front of me, I can measure the stalk. Now I'm going to estimate how many times the stalk goes into the pear, because when I transfer it to my paper, which I'll show you how, I'm going to need the same proportions. So that's one stalk on, that's my yardstick, that's one stalk. And now I'm going to, estimate how many stalks goes into the pear. So it goes 1, 2, and maybe a tiny bit at the bottom there. Okay, so my fingers were getting in the way. If I do it off the page, if I look at the, okay, so that's about 1, so it goes 1, and I'm trying to remember where's my pencil mark of my thumb. 1, 2, and you can see there's a little bit more, 2 1/3, something like that. So the estimation is fine. It doesn't have to be perfect. So having all that information about how big the stalk is, I've now got to translate that information onto how to draw it. Before I do that, because that's quite a big deal, I want to point out that when I took this photograph, and some of you might recognize this from my book, I deliberately found pairs and physically measured the pairs to try and make sure that each of the pairs in this photograph were physically the same size. Because where proportion also gets us confused is when we're looking at objects that are physically the same size, we sometimes have difficulty in drawing them when they are further away from our eyes. And as you might know already, you've experienced this for yourself, as things go further away from us, the things in the distance, the things that are further away from us, actually get visually smaller. So there again, there's the size of my first pair that I measured, and you can see without measuring, but if I measure that pair against the big pair, you can see it's smaller, and I measure that pair against the big pair and it's even smaller. However, the proportion of those pairs is probably going to be very similar. I tried to get similar shaped pairs. So even if the whole object gets smaller as it moves away from you, let's see if the proportion changes. So we already know that the proportion of that to that is the same. I'm going to take a clean bit of newspaper, or maybe I'll do it with my pencil like I've been doing the others, because that makes it more useful for you. So the width of that pair is that, and if I'm correct, the height should be the same. There it is. So the proportion of that pair is the same as the proportion of this pair, even though it's not the right size. You seeing where I'm coming from? That is equal to that on that pair, which is the same as this on this pair, which is that is equal to that. Let's see if that makes sense for the very last pair, and I will measure it with my pencil visually. So that's the width. And if I turn it round, sorry, I have to turn my paper because I can't scooch it there. And yep, that pair is pretty much exactly the same proportions as these two pairs, even though it is a different size. So physically it was the same size, visually it is smaller. Proportions, again, I'm going to say this again and again and again so it gets into your heads. Proportion is one measurement compared to the other. So that, in this instance, compared to that. Then I went to how many times does the stalk fit in, and I came up with 2 and a bit for this pair. It might change for the other pairs because their stalks might not be the same size. Let's check this stalk here. So that stalk is about that tall. How many times does that go into the pair? 1, 2, yeah, about the same proportion as that. So with our pairs, at least, we've got similar proportions. How do we transfer that to your page? And this is where people really become unstuck. Practice it yourself, because the way it's going to become clear is for you to do it yourself. I'm going to be transferring the proportion of the pairs onto my drawing. And the very, very first thing that you need to do is make a decision on what size you want your pair. So before you can transfer any measurements that you've measured, visually measured, from the actual object in your observation, you have to decide, what size do I want my pairs to be? So if I want to draw a picture of the pair and I want to put it on a gift card like we spoke about last week, then I only want my pair to fill that. If I want to do a nice big painting, then I might decide that I want my pair to go all the way up from there to there, and I want it to be an enormous pair. Okay, so it is imperative that you make a first decision, because unless you've got one of those parameters to compare your measurement to get your proportion, you won't be able to transfer it. Now, one thing that many people get confused with, and I'm going to help you out. A lot of people measure something on their pencil, so exactly like I was doing here, and they've got that measurement on their pencil and they go, well, what do I do now? What do I do with that measurement? Just having one measurement is useless information. That doesn't help you at all. You are not going to put that tiny bit of pencil on your page and go, I'm going to draw a tiny pair like that. So just having that on your pencil is never useful. It is not information. Always it's about that compared to something else. So having said that, I've then said choose a size. Now we can do a proportion. And I'm going to choose a size that's somewhere not quite either of those two. And I'm going to go, I want my pair to be that big. And at the moment I'm talking about without a stalk. You may want to put a stalk in and include those measurements with the stalk. That's up to you, but just I find this easier. Because we found out that the pair was as wide as it is tall, I now need to put some marks on my paper to show how wide it is. So I don't want to measure that and find out some inches, so I'm going to use a piece of paper, or I can use my pencil and I can go, okay, I've chosen my height to be that big. So I'm going to put my pencil down, and therefore I've just moved that height to the width. Hope you follow that. So now I can even draw a box, because I know when I measured my proportions with my pencil, I found out that the width was the same as the height. I'm going to repeat that all of the time, which means my pear should now fit in that square, because I've drawn a square where the height is the same as the width. And if I look at my pear, I've got my picture in front of me, I make sure that the width is against the edges and the bottom is against the bottom and the top is against the top. So you have to draw it so that it fits the structure lines, the parameters that you've put in. There's no point in drawing your square, right, because that's showing you that that's the same as that. You could actually even draw a circle, because a circle's got the same height as it's got width. But there's no point in drawing your pear inside if you don't follow the measurements that you've put down. Okay, so make sure that you go out like that. The second thing we measured was how many of these stalks go into the height. And this is where it gets a little bit difficult. And your estimation skills come to the fore. So we measured that the stalk goes in 1, 2 and a half, or 2 and a bit. Okay, so if I were to put a line where the halfway mark is, that would mean, if I used that as my measure, if the stalk was halfway, then I could easily do halfway. But we know that the stalk was smaller than halfway because it went in 2 and a bit. So I'm just going to estimate, and I'm going to pull my pencil back a bit, and I'm going to say, okay, it's just a little bit more, it's just a little bit smaller than halfway because it went in 2.5 times. So if I go 1, 2, then I can get my half. So I'm estimating that the stalk is about that big. I'm popping it there, putting my pencil there. So this pear now has got the same proportions as that pear and the last one. So I have transferred the proportions, even though my pear is bigger than that pear. That's how we measure proportions visually, and how we transfer it by making a decision on a first size, and it's usually the biggest size, so how high is the object, so that we can transfer those proportions. There's another way in which proportions become useful, because we don't always have the same objects. Okay, we have lots of different objects if we're doing a still life, or if you're drawing a portrait, you've got eyes which are different shapes and sizes to the nose and the mouth and all of that sort of thing. So I want to show you how I use proportion in that regard to help you to draw the whole thing. What happens when we've got a still life and we're not just drawing one item, okay? So that first demonstration was the proportion of one item to itself, really. How tall is it, and how wide is it to itself. What happens, however, when we get, we're looking at a still life, or we're looking at a landscape or a portrait, it doesn't matter what you're looking at. We need to use those proportions in a different way. In the same way, but extend it. So if we were drawing this, for example, and I often, when I'm teaching drawing still life, I often say, use the measurements of the first thing, the thing that you can see completely. So I can see that apple completely, it's not obscured by anything else, and all of these other things are overlapped by something else. So it won't be as easy to measure the proportions of these items, because some parts of it we can't see. I can estimate where the side of that bowl is, and I can measure the side of the bowl by estimating, but it's much easier if we are seeing something completely. So in this instance, if I wanted to draw this still life, I'm going to start with doing exactly what I did to the pear, and I'm going to measure this apple because I'm going to start off by drawing the apple. But when I'm deciding the size of the apple in my picture, I need to be aware of these other things because I'm going to leave space for them in my picture. So again, I'm measuring my width and I'm comparing it to my height. Can you see that? Yep. And I can see that it's actually wider than it is tall because it's going up to there, not including the stalk. So it's, here's a technical word, it's a smidge smaller. It's only a little bit smaller, okay? So if I wanted to, I could have started off with the height of the apple like that, measured it like that, compared that to the width, and you can see it's just a tiny bit smaller. So if I go to my page now, and I'm going to say, I want my apple to be that high, and I'm putting it in that corner of my page because I want to put my pear there, I want to put my jar there, I want to put a bowl there, and I want room for that big vase. I'm not going to be drawing the whole thing, but I'll show you the steps. So I've made that decision that that's my height, and we found out when we measured our proportions of the apple that the height was a little bit less than the width. So my height is that. It's a little bit less than the width. So I'm going to get another pencil and I'm going to go, let's make it a little bit bigger than the height. That's the height. Compare it to the width. Yep, that's about right. It's a little bit bigger. Yep. So now I can kind of draw my apple in, trying to keep it to the size that I put in, all those marks that I put in, looking at the shape of the apple in the photograph. And I now want to put the stalk on my apple. Now, unlike the pear, or the other picture, where the stalk came right out of the top of the pear, this stalk comes out slightly below the back of the apple. But I'm still going to measure my stalk in the same way as I measured it with the pear. And I'm going to go, how many times does that stalk go in? And I'm going to estimate 1, 2, nearly 3 times this side. So if I go to my apple here, I'm estimating where's thirds, breaking my apple into thirds. I'm going to measure, we said it was nearly 3 times. Let me check that again. There's my stalk, and it goes 1, 2, just under 3 times. So it needs to be a bit bigger than a third. So that's a bit bigger than the third, and I can put my stalk on there. But my stalk doesn't go from the very top of the apple, it goes below the apple. So I'm going to lower it a bit, and I'm going to put a mark there and a mark there so that my apple stalk does something like that. Don't worry about my drawing skills. I'm not worried about them now. This is just to demonstrate how to use these proportions. And so that is representation of the apple. I've measured the stalk against how big the apple is, and I've started the stalk a bit lower because I can see that the back of the apple goes behind the stalk. There are lots of different ways of doing this. For example, I can see that the the apple goes behind about halfway up the stalk. So there's lots of little things that you can use, but I wanted to use the proportions that I'd measured. Now things get interesting. Yes, you can come to the pear now and go, how big is the pear relative to how wide it is? How big is the stalk relative to how many times it goes into the pear? And you can do that with all of these items. But it doesn't really help you, because you want all of these items to be in proportion with each other this time. So not only in proportion to itself, but in proportion to the other things that you are drawing. And this is where it becomes really, really crucial. So if we go back to these pears, I drew them before I measured that they were all exactly the same proportion to themselves. But if I wanted to draw them as they look, I would have needed to measure this pear and say, how big is this pear compared to this front one? Because visually they look smaller. And you can see that that pear is about half of the front pear. So now that I've used that apple, I need to use the measurement, the yardstick of the apple each time I draw something else in. I need to not choose the size of the pear because I've already chosen the size of the apple. I need to say, how big is this pear relative to the apple? So I'm going to go, how tall is this pear? Now I know the pear's crooked, but I won't know what angle to put that on my page if I use the angled pear. So I'm going to use my pencil vertically, and I'm going to match the top of my pencil against the top of the pear. And remember, I'm imagining that I'm looking at the pears and things in front of me, and I'm using my pencil like that. So I go, how tall is this pear compared to the apple this time? And it's a little bit bigger than the apple. Maybe it's the same size as the width. So I'm going to measure that again, because that would be useful. If I go, how tall is that pear compared to the width of the apple? It's exactly the same. So I've got a nice proportion to use for my pear on my drawing. I now know that the pear is as high as this apple is wide. So I'm only using the measurements we got in the apple. So now I know that on my picture, that's the width of the apple. So that's going to be the height of the pear. I don't have to make a decision about how big the pear is, because it has to relate to the apple that I've already put down. However, I do need to know where about it starts on the page. Is it down here? Is it up there? So I need to observe on my picture or on the still life in front of me, where is that line? Where does the visual pear start with reference to this apple? And I can do some things like putting my pencil there visually. You can see that. And that's about, what, 2/3 down of the apple? So if I go, yeah, that's about 2/3 down. Remember, I looked at the 2/3. So I'm estimating that my pear will begin here. What was that proportion again? It was the width of my apple is the height of my pear without the stalk. So this begins to get a little bit complicated, but you will warm up into it and you'll start realizing how useful it is to just measure that against everything. The pear also has a width, but instead of using the whole pear, because I can't see the width of it there, I know I can judge kind of where it goes, but I can also judge how wide is the pear from where it touches the apple, right? So it touches the apple there, and it's about that width. Now, as I told you before, that measurement is useless information. It is not the same measurement directly on the page. We're not transferring an actual measurement, okay? So what I have to do with that measurement there is compare it to something I've already done on the apple. So I'm going to go, oh, it's about 2/3 of the height. It's not quite half of the width, not very useful. Yeah, it's about 2/3, I'm guessing, of the height, right? So now I know, coming back to my apple, 2/3 of my apple is about that. Therefore, it's butted up against. So my pear is going to now fit into, where does it come out the top of the apple there? So that lines up a bit with the front of the stalk, so it's about there. So I now know that my pear needs to fit into those parameters. So let me repeat that. I measured from the apple to the side of the pear, and I found out how much that compared with the apple, and I estimated that it was 2/3. So I'm showing you on a piece of paper now. That's 2/3 of my apple. Forget about the other apple. Therefore, my pear needs to end there, and I know how high it is. I know that it starts down there. So the only other thing I needed to look at was where the pear intersected with the apple, and I reckoned it was about the same level as that. So that's where that intersected. I could have also measured from where that intersected to the edge and compared that with my apple. So there's lots of ways of doing it, and that's nearly the height of the apple. So if I go back here and I go, well, nearly the height of the apple is about there. Let's see if it translates. Yeah, pretty close. So there's a number of different ways, and it doesn't have to be perfect. We just need to get a sense of how is this thing working. I can also then go, how big is this stalk compared to the pear? But this time, that's what we did at the beginning, this time I don't actually want to compare it to the pear, because the pear is relating to the apple, and I want to relate everything to the apple. So I'm going to go, how big is this stalk relative to something on the apple? So I'm going to go, is it about the same size as the apple stalk? Yep, it is actually. So then I'm going to go to my apple stalk, and I'm going to go, well, the apple stalk is that big, therefore the stalk on my pear is going to be that big. And let's draw this thing in, because that'll help me to put my stalk on. Needs to go out to where we measured. Something like that, maybe. And the stalk, now I did something wrong. I put that there based on going right from the top of the stalk, but it starts about there. So if I get how big is the apple stalk, and I put it, oh, I did do it right. And there's the stalk of my pear. So what I wanted to show you was that I measured the pear against the apple, not necessarily against itself. You can do that, but the more you use your first measurement, the better everything will be, because everything else will relate to the first thing that you measured. In case that's wrong, because so if you measure that and you measure the bottle against that and then the bowl against the bottle, everything might get one step out of action. So I can see the time is racing ahead. Hadn't intended to take so long, but I really wanted to explain it very carefully. And just briefly, still using the size of the apple, let's measure how big the bowl is. Okay, still the same thing, and I'm putting it on the bowl and I'm going, well, it's about 1.5. Just a bit bigger than 1.5, really. Let's try the height of the apple. That might work better than the... So 1, nearly 2, 1 3/4. Did you see that? So measure the apple. 1 on the photograph. So it goes 1 there and 3/4. I now need to use that proportion to go 1. Forgot to do something. Where does the bowl start? Well, it starts about there. I need to know where it starts so that I can put that 1 3/4 in. So 1 3/4 apples goes into the bowl. So that's 1, that's 2, but it's 3/4. So that's where the bowl ends. Thank you for joining me once again, and Karen Frankel signing out saying get drawing. Bye bye.